In the freezing February twilight of 1775, nearly 2 months before the world would hear the shot heard round the world at Lexington and Concord, a British warship, the HMS Lively, silently dropped anchor off the coast of Marblehead, Massachusetts. On board were 240 elite British regulars of the 64th Regiment of Foot, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Leslie. Their mission was top secret, sanctioned by the Crown. March into the rebellious heart of Salem, seize a massive hidden cache of stolen brass cannons, and crush the American rebellion before it could even begin. But history is not written merely by the march of armies. It is forged in the shadows by tavern keepers, teenage messengers, defiant blacksmiths, and invisible networks of spies. What unfolded over the next 48 hours was an astonishing, almost absurdly tense standoff that nearly rewrote the destiny of the United States, a tale of deception, forgotten heroism, and a ghostly omen that haunted the American coast. The whispers in the tavern, the air inside the Sun Tavern in Salem, was thick with the scent of pipe tobacco, spilled ale, and sedition. It was Friday, February 24, 1775. For months, the atmosphere across the Massachusetts Bay Colony had been a tinderbox. The British Parliament had closed the port of Boston as punishment for the infamous Tea Party, and the Royal Governor, General Thomas Gage, was growing desperate. Gage knew the colonists were smuggling gunpowder and artillery into the countryside. He knew rebellion was brewing. Sitting in the corner of the tavern, nursing a tankard of dark flip, was a man named Captain David Mason. To the casual observer, Mason was a respectable local businessman. In reality, he was an agent of the Salem Committee of Safety, the underground resistance. Earlier that week, Mason had received a frantic, coded message from a contact in Boston. General Gage had caught wind of Salem's secret. Somewhere in the North Fields of Salem, hidden inside the blacksmith shop of a patriot named Robert Foster, were 19 brass field pieces, thousands of pounds of gunpowder, and medical supplies smuggled from the West Indies. "They are coming," Mason whispered to the man sitting across from him, a fierce patriot named Colonel Timothy Pickering. "Gage has ordered Leslie's regiment to move. They will arrive by sea to avoid our lookouts on the Boston Neck." Pickering, a stern man with an iron jaw, leaned in close. "How many?" 240 regulars, Mason replied. "They think it will be an easy prize. They believe Salem will cower." Pickering smiled grimly. "They do not know Salem." The plan was set into motion. The Patriots had less than 36 hours to hide the artillery. If the British found the cannons, the Continental resistance would be disarmed before it could even form an army. But Mason and Pickering had an ace up their sleeve, an intricate, highly illegal network of civilian lookouts that stretched from the rocky cliffs of Marblehead all the way to the frozen rivers of Danvers. The midnight ride of the unknown boy fast forward to Sunday morning, February 26. It was a bitterly cold Sabbath. In the 18th century, New England Sundays were sacred. The entire town of Salem was packed inside the First Parish Church, listening to the fiery sermon of the Reverend Thomas Barnard. The streets were dead silent, covered in a thick blanket of fresh snow. Rivers of Danvers. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the church were flung open. A young boy, no older than 14, stood in the doorway, gasping for breath. His horse was outside, lathered in sweat and shivering. "The regulars!" the boy screamed, his voice cracking with terror. "The regulars have landed at Marblehead. They are marching on Salem." The congregation erupted into chaos. Rivers of Danvers. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the church were flung open. A young boy, no older than 14, stood in the doorway, gasping for breath. His horse was outside, lathered in sweat and shivering. "The regulars!" the boy screamed, his voice cracking with terror. "The regulars have landed at Marblehead. They are marching on Salem." The congregation erupted into chaos. Reverend Barnard raised his hands, his voice booming over the panic. "Calm yourselves, God is our fortress." But Captain Mason, Colonel Pickering, do your duty. While the congregation emptied into the snowy streets, the true genius of the colonial resistance began. As Lieutenant Colonel Leslie and his redcoats marched the 5 miles from Marblehead to Salem, their boots crunching loudly in the snow, they believed they had the element of surprise. What they didn't realize was that every church bell along the coast had begun to toll. Clang, 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 the alarm spread like wildfire. From farms, taverns, and coastal fishing shacks, men grabbed their muskets, pitchforks, and clubs. They didn't have uniforms, but they had an overwhelming sense of ownership over their land. Meanwhile, at Robert Foster's blacksmith shop in the North Fields, A desperate race against time was underway. Mason, Foster, and a dozen townspeople were frantically loading the massive brass cannons onto heavy wooden carts. The ground was muddy and slick with melting snow. "Hurry," Foster shouted, his muscles straining against the weight of a 12-pounder cannon. "If they cross the North Bridge, we lose everything." The Patriots dragged the cannons deep into the woods, burying them under piles of rotting leaves, gravel, and manure. Others were hidden under the floorboards of nearby barns. By the time the British bayonets glinted at the edge of Salem town, the cannons were gone, but the danger was far from over. To secure their escape, the Patriots had to stop the British from crossing the North River. At precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel Leslie led his column into the center of Salem. The townspeople lined the streets, staring at the British soldiers with cold, unblinking hatred. Leslie, a proud and capable officer, ignored them, marching his men straight toward the North Bridge, the only gateway to the North Fields where the cannons were suspected to be. But when Leslie reached the river, he stopped dead in his tracks. The Patriots had raised the drawbridge. Standing on the opposite side of the freezing, rushing river were Colonel Timothy Pickering and approximately 40 local militiamen. They were vastly outnumbered, but they held the high ground. Leslie strode to the edge of the broken bridge, his face flushing red with anger. "Lower the bridge in the king's name," he bellowed. Pickering stepped forward, his voice steady and defiant. "This bridge is private property, Colonel. It belongs to the town of Salem. The king has no right to demand its lowering, nor do you have the right to cross it." "I have the king's orders to march through these lands," Leslie shouted back. "If you do not lower this bridge, I will fire upon your people." On the Salem side of the river, a crowd of hundreds of citizens, men, women, and children, had gathered behind the British line. Among them was a notorious local woman named Sarah Tarrant. Hearing Leslie's threat, she leaned out of a second-story window overlooking the bridge and screamed at the British officer, "Fire then, you brown-best villains! If you fire, we will fire back, and not a single one of you will leave Salem alive." A British soldier aimed his musket at Sarah, but she didn't flinch. "Go ahead and shoot. You are nothing but a pack of lobsters." The tension was suffocating. One accidental discharge of a musket, one nervous finger on a trigger, and the American Revolution would have begun right there, on a freezing bridge in Salem, 2 months before Lexington. Frustrated by the drawbridge, Leslie looked down at the riverbank. There, tied to the wharves, were several large, flat-bottomed boats called gondolas. "Seize those boats," Leslie ordered his men. "We will ferry the troops across." Seeing this, the owner of the boats, a fierce patriot named Richard Darby, shouted to his men, "Scuttle them! Don't let the king's men have them." Robert Foster and a few other patriots jumped into the freezing water with axes, furiously chopping holes into the bottoms of their own boats to sink them. British soldiers rushed down the bank with fixed bayonets to stop them. A scuffle broke out in the mud. A British soldier lunged with his bayonet, striking a local man named Joseph Witcher in the chest. Witcher fell back, blood-soaking. Through his wool shirt, it was the first blood spilled in the defense of American liberty. The sight of blood infuriated the crowd. The militia on the other side of the river cocked their muskets. The click of dozens of gunlocks echoed over the water. Seeing that a total massacre was imminent, Reverend Thomas Barnard stepped between the two opposing forces. He appealed to Leslie's sense of honor and prudence. "Colonel Leslie," Barnard said, his voice calm and persuasive, "you cannot force this pass. The entire county is rising against you. Look around. There are thousands of men marching this way from Marblehead, Danvers, and Beverly. If you fire a single shot, you and your men will be annihilated. Let us find a compromise." Leslie knew the minister was right. His retreat by sea would be cut off if the entire countryside rose up. He was an officer, not a butcher. "I have orders to cross this bridge," Leslie insisted, trying to save face. "I cannot return to Boston without fulfilling my orders." Pickering and Barnard offered a brilliant, face-saving solution. "If we lower the bridge, will you pledge your word of honor to march no more than 30 rods into the North Fields? Turn around and march back to your ship without disturbing any property." Leslie hesitated. It was a bizarre compromise, but it allowed him to obey the literal text of his orders to cross the bridge without triggering a bloody war he wasn't prepared to fight. "I agree," Leslie said. The drawbridge was lowered. The British regulars marched across, counted out exactly 30 rods, about 165 yards into the snowy fields, turned on their heels and marched back toward Marblehead. The secret cannons remained safely buried just a few hundred yards away. Salem had successfully defied the might of the British Empire without losing a single life. While the land was preparing for war, the sea was yielding its own terrifying mysteries. To understand the psychological state of the American colonies on the eve of the Revolution, one must understand the deep, superstitious nature of the coastal towns. No story illustrates this more profoundly than the legend of the ghost ship of New Haven, a true historical event from the preceding century that became a rallying cry and an omen for the generation of 1775. In the mid-17th century, the colony of New Haven, Connecticut, was struggling. Economically, desperate to establish direct trade with England, the town's merchants pooled their remaining wealth to build a massive, state-of-the-art merchant ship. She was called the Great Ship, loaded with pelts, grain, and the hopes of the entire colony. In January 1646, the ship set sail into a frozen, fog-choked Atlantic, commanded by the experienced Captain George Lamberton. The harbor was so frozen that the townspeople had to chop a 3-mile trench through the ice just to let the ship pass. Months passed. Spring turned to summer and summer to winter. The great ship never arrived in England. She vanished without a trace. The economic loss devastated New Haven, and a cloud of grief settled over the town. Then in June 1648, a violent thunderstorm rolled through New Haven, and a cloud of grief settled over the town. Then in June 1648, a violent thunderstorm rolled through New Haven. After the storm cleared, around an hour before sunset, a strange light appeared on the horizon of the Long Island Sound. The townspeople rushed to the shore. What they saw defied human comprehension. Sailing directly against the wind into the harbor was a magnificent 3-masted ship. As it drew closer, the crowd gasped. It was the Great Ship. They could see Captain Lamberton standing on the deck, pointing his sword toward the sea. They could see the sailors rigging the sails. The townspeople fell to their knees, weeping and praying, believing their loved ones had returned, but the joy quickly turned to horror. As the phantom ship drew closer to the shore, a sudden, terrified crowd, God has granted us this vision to show us the tragic fate of our friends that we may find closure. For over a century, the story of the ghost ship was passed down through generations of New Englanders. By 1775, as the colonies prepared to launch themselves into a perilous war against the greatest naval power on Earth, the legend took on a new prophetic meaning. The Patriots viewed the ghost ship as a reminder that even the grandest, most powerful vessels built by human hands could be destroyed by the will of the Almighty. It gave the coastal militiamen, the privateers of Salem, Beverly, and Boston, the spiritual courage to face the Royal Navy. As the war finally erupted in April 1775 at Lexington and Concord, the focus shifted from Massachusetts to New York. George Washington, newly appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, quickly realized that he could not defeat the British through conventional warfare alone. The British Army was too well-trained, too well-equipped, and too numerous. "We must fight them in the shadows," Washington wrote to his close confidant Benjamin Tallmadge. Thus the most sophisticated, successful, and dangerous espionage ring in American history was born, the Culper Spy Ring. Operating out of British-occupied New York City, Long Island, and Connecticut, this secret network provided Washington with the critical intelligence he needed to survive the war. The members of the ring were not professional spies. They were ordinary citizens, a tailor, a tavern keeper, a housewife, and a quiet farmer, if caught. The ring was managed by Benjamin Tallmadge, Washington's director of military intelligence. To protect their identities, Tallmadge created a complex code system using numbers instead of names. George Washington was Agent 711. New York was 727. A spy was 723. They used invisible ink, invented by John Jay's brother, James Jay, that could only be revealed by a specific chemical reagent. The primary operative inside New York City was a man named Robert Townsend, code name Samuel Culper Jr. Townsend was a quiet, unassuming merchant and journalist who frequented the coffee houses and taverns where British officers drank and boasted. Townsend had a photographic memory. He would listen to British officers discuss troop movements, supply lines, and naval strategies, write the information down using the code, and pass it along a highly perilous chain of couriers. The chain worked like this. Robert Townsend gathered the intelligence in New York City. He passed it to Austin Rowe, a daring tavern keeper from Sedauket, Long Island, who rode 50 miles on horseback under the pretense of buying supplies for his tavern. Rowe left the letters hidden in a dead drop on the property of Abraham Woodhull, Samuel Culper Sr., who managed the ring's operations on Long Island. Woodhull then needed to get the letters across the Long Island Sound to Tallmadge in Connecticut. To do this safely, he relied on a woman whose identity remains one of history's greatest mysteries, Agent 355. In the codebook of the Culper Spy Ring, the number 355 stood simply for lady. Yet, this anonymous woman played a role so pivotal that her actions saved the American Revolution from a catastrophic betrayal. Historians believe Agent 355 was a young, highly intelligent woman from a prominent Loyalist family in New York City. Because of her social status, she was frequently invited to lavish British galas, balls, and dinners. She chatted amiably with high-ranking British officers, including the charming Major John Andre, the head of British intelligence. The Redcoats viewed her as a beautiful, harmless Loyalist girl. In reality, she was a fervent patriot, using her charm to extract military secrets that no man could ever get close to. Agent 355 worked in tandem with a Long Island whaleboat captain named Caleb Brewster. Brewster was a fierce, physically imposing man who operated a fleet of stealthy whaleboats, darting across the Long Island Sound under the cover of darkness to evade British warships. But how did Brewster know where to meet the spies to collect the information without getting caught by British patrols? Enter Anna Strong, a brave housewife living in Setauket, Long Island. Anna's husband had been arrested by the British and imprisoned on a notorious, disease-ridden prison ship in New York Harbor. Left alone, Anna used her everyday household chores to create a brilliant, highly visible signal system. Anna's property overlooked the shores of the Long Island Sound. Whenever Caleb Brewster arrived with his whaleboat and hid in one of the many secluded coves along the coast, Anna would hang a black silk petticoat on her clothesline. To any passing British patrol, it looked like a woman drying her laundry. To Abraham Woodhull, it was the green light. To tell Woodhull exactly which cove Brewster was hiding in, Anna would hang a specific number of white handkerchiefs alongside the petticoat. One handkerchief meant cove number 1-3. Handkerchiefs meant cove number 3. Woodhull would see the signal through his spyglass, retrieve the hidden letters from the dead drop, and meet Brewster under the cover of night. Brewster would then row furiously across the Sound to Connecticut, where Benjamin Tallmadge would deliver the message to George Washington via a relay of fast horses. Through this clothesline code, Washington received intelligence within days of it being whispered in New York's finest ballrooms. In the summer of 1780, the Culper Spy Ring faced its ultimate test. Robert Townsend and Agent 355 began to pick up terrifying rumors in New York City. A high-ranking American officer, a legendary hero of the Battle of Saratoga, was in secret negotiations with Major John Andre to defect to the British. The spies worked frantically to uncover the identity of the traitor. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place when Agent 355 intercepted information, suggesting that a massive British expedition was preparing to launch a surprise attack on West Point, a vital American fortress on the Hudson River. If West Point fell, the British would control the entire Hudson River, effectively cutting the American colonies in half and ending the war. The commander of West Point was none other than General Benedict Arnold. Arnold, embittered by a lack of recognition from Congress and deeply in debt, had decided to sell his country for gold and a commission in the British Army. He had provided Major Andre with detailed blueprints of West Point's defenses, highlighting the weak spots in the fort. On September 21, 1780, Major Andre traveled up the Hudson River on a British warship, the HMS Vulture, to meet Arnold in secret near Haverstraw, New York. Arnold handed Andre the treasonous documents, which Andre hid inside his boot. But the Culper Spy Ring's intelligence had already put Washington's forces on high alert. As Andre attempted to travel back to New York City by land, disguised in civilian clothes, he was stopped in Tarrytown by 3 local militiamen, John Paulding, David Williams, and Isaac Van Wart. "What is your business here?" Paulding demanded, leveling his musket. Andre, confused by Paulding's coat, which was a British-style refuge garment Paulding had stolen while escaping a British prison, made a fatal mistake. "Gentlemen, I hope you belong to our party, the King's party." "We do not," Paulding replied coldly. "Dismount." The militiamen searched Andre. When they forced him to take off his boots, they discovered the fatal papers clutched beneath his stockings. "My God," Paulding whispered, reading the handwriting. "This is treason." Andre was arrested and brought to Benjamin Tallmadge. When Tallmadge saw the papers, his heart sank. He immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. Benedict Arnold learned of Andre's capture just hours before George Washington arrived at West Point for a scheduled inspection. Arnold fled down the river on a barge, escaping to the safety of the British lines, but his plot to destroy the American army had been shattered. Major John Andre was put on trial as a spy. Despite his charm and pleas for a soldier's death by firing squad, George Washington was resolute. Spies were hanged. On October 2, 1780, Andre was led to the gallows in Tappan, New York. He placed the noose around his own neck, tied a handkerchief over his eyes, and met his end with dignity. But for the Culper Spy Ring, the victory came at a devastating cost. In the wake of Benedict Arnold's defection, a wave of terror swept through New York City. Furious that his plot had been foiled, Arnold sought revenge. He knew there was a spy ring operating under his nose, and he began rounding up suspected patriots with brutal efficiency. Among those arrested in late 1780 was a pregnant young woman, suspected of having connections to the underground resistance. She was taken to the most horrific place in the entire British Empire, the HMS Jersey. The Jersey was a decommissioned 64-gun British warship anchored in Wallabout Bay, modern-day Brooklyn. It had been stripped of its masts and converted into a floating prison for American captives. The conditions on board were hellish. Over 1,000 men and women were crammed into the dark, unventilated. Lower decks, the air was thick with the stench of disease, rotting food, and death. Dysentery, smallpox, and typhoid ran rampant. Every morning, the British guards would open the hatches and shout down into the darkness, "Rebels, turn out your dead." More Americans died on British prison ships like the HMS Jersey than in all the battles of the Revolutionary War combined, approximately 11,500. Souls perished in the filth of Wallabout Bay. Agent 355, accustomed to the high society of New York's elite, found herself trapped in this living nightmare. Despite facing intense interrogation and psychological torture, she never broke. She never revealed the names of Robert Townsend, Austin Roe, Abraham Woodhull, or Benjamin Tallmadge. She carried the secrets of the Culper Spy Ring to her grave. Sometime in early 1781, Agent 355 died on board the HMS Jersey. Her body, like thousands of others, was buried in a shallow, unmarked grave along the muddy shores of Brooklyn. Though her name is lost to time, her sacrifice ensured that George Washington's army lived to fight another day, leading directly to the ultimate American victory at Yorktown later that year. When the war finally ended in 1783, the British evacuated New York City, and George Washington marched his victorious army through the streets. He requested a private meeting with Robert Townsend. Washington wanted to look the man who had saved his army in the eye and thank him. Townsend, characteristically quiet, requested that their meeting remain a total secret. He never claimed a single dollar of reward money, nor did he ever publicly reveal his role as Samuel Culper Jr. For nearly 150 years, the identities of the Culper Spy Ring remained completely unknown to the public. It wasn't until the 1930s, when a historian named Morton Pennepacker compared the handwriting of Robert Townsend's business letters with the coded letters sent to George Washington, that the truth was finally. The American Revolution is often remembered as a series of grand battles fought by men in pristine uniforms, monuments to generals and statesmen. But the true story of how America was born is found in the forgotten mud of the North Bridge in Salem, where a community stood down an army without firing a shot. It is found in the superstitious awe of coastal fishermen who drew strength from phantom ships, and most of all, it is found in the quiet heroism of ordinary citizens who risked everything for the promise of a free tomorrow. They fought in the dark so that their descendants could walk in the light. Their names may have faded into the whispers of history, but the nation they built stands as an enduring monument to their silent, astonishing courage.